Judge Aileen Cannon slaps Karoline Leavitt with $30,000 fine. Her sharp comeback stuns court. The gavel slammed so hard it cracked. Blood ran down Judge Aileen Cannon's palm as splinters embedded themselves in her skin. But she didn't flinch. Her steely gaze remained fixed on the young woman standing before her, whose composed exterior masked the thunderstorm brewing within. The entire courtroom fell into a silence so profound that the slight drip of the judge's blood onto the polished wood of her bench echoed like distant thunder. "That will be $30,000, Ms. Leavitt," Judge Cannon said, her voice carrying no hint of the pain from her injured hand. "Perhaps that will remind you that in my courtroom, the Constitution still means something." It was 9:47 a.m. on a sweltering Tuesday in May 2025. And Karoline Leavitt had just made the most consequential mistake of her meteoric political career. 12 hours earlier, the federal courthouse in Fort Pierce, Florida stood silent and dark, its imposing neoclassical columns casting long shadows under the moonlight. A solitary light burned in a third-floor window where Judge Aileen Cannon sat alone, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and precedents. The case before her had drawn national attention, becoming a political lightning rod that threatened to consume her carefully built reputation. For judicial impartiality. At 43, Judge Cannon had ascended to the federal bench 5 years earlier. Her appointment by then-President Trump had been controversial, as all judicial appointments had become in the polarized atmosphere of American politics. But she had surprised many with her independence, though conservative in judicial philosophy. She had shown an unwavering commitment to procedure that sometimes frustrated both sides of the political divide. Tonight, that commitment was being tested. The documents spread across her desk detailed a pattern of increasingly inflammatory public statements by Karoline Leavitt, the 28-year-old former White House spokesperson, who now served as communications director for a prominent conservative political action committee. The PAC was not directly involved in the case before Judge Cannon, a complex matter involving campaign finance regulations. But Leavitt had inserted herself into the proceedings through a series of media appearances that had crossed the line from commentary to attempted jury influence. Judge Cannon rubbed her temples. The headache that had started that morning was building to a crescendo. She reached for her coffee, now cold, and grimaced as she took a sip. On her computer screen, a video played on mute. Leavitt on a popular cable news program, gesturing animatedly as the chyron beneath her read Judge Cannon's court, biased justice. The irony wasn't lost on Cannon. She had been appointed by Trump, and now one of Trump's most vocal supporters was publicly questioning her impartiality, not because she had ruled against conservative interests, but because she had insisted on equal application of the law. The judge muted the video for a moment. "What we're seeing in Judge Cannon's courtroom is a clear double standard," Leavitt was saying, her delivery polished and confident. "Democratic operatives can make whatever claims they want about this case. But when our side points out the obvious legal flaws, suddenly there's talk of contempt. The American people aren't stupid. They can see this selective enforcement for what it is." Cannon muted the video again and closed her eyes. The statements were a clear violation of her previous warning to all parties about making prejudicial statements in the media. The problem wasn't just that Leavitt had criticized the court that was her First Amendment right, but that she had deliberately mischaracterized sealed proceedings in ways that could influence potential jurors. The judge opened a drawer and pulled out her personal notebook. This decision wouldn't be made in anger or haste. She needed to consider all angles, all potential consequences, as she began to write. The enormity of what she was contemplating weighed heavily on her shoulders. A significant contempt ruling against someone of Leavitt's prominence would create a media firestorm. Regardless of its legal merit, outside her window, a tropical storm was brewing, the distant lightning illuminating the darkened coastline. It seemed fitting. This external manifestation of the storm she knew would break once her ruling was made public. The following morning dawned bright and humid, the storm having passed in the night. By 7 a.m., the courthouse plaza was already filling. with protesters and counter-protesters. Their competing chants creating a discordant symphony of American division. News vans lined the adjacent streets, satellite dishes aimed skyward like modern-day divining rods. Seeking not water but the lifeblood of the 24-hour news cycle, controversy inside her chambers. Judge Cannon reviewed her notes one final time. She had slept little, but her mind was clear. The path ahead was difficult but necessary. The integrity of her court of the judicial system itself demanded action. Her clerk, a brilliant young woman named Sophia Martinez, knocked softly before entering. "Judge, Ms. Leavitt has arrived with her attorney," she said. "They're waiting." In conference room, Buchanan nodded, gathering her papers. "And Mr. Harrington, the prosecutor is already in the courtroom with his team." "Good." The judge stood, smoothing the front of her black robe. "Let's not keep them waiting." As she made her way through the private corridor that led to the courtroom, Judge Cannon mentally prepared herself for what was to come. In her 6 years on the bench, she had made many difficult rulings, but few that would generate the public scrutiny this one would. The courtroom was nearly full when she entered. The gallery buzzed with the murmurs of reporters, legal observers, and a few members of the public lucky enough to secure a seat. At the prosecution table sat United States Attorney James Harrington, flanked by 2 assistant prosecutors. The defense table remained empty, awaiting Leavitt and her counsel. As Judge Cannon took her seat, the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise." The United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida is now in session. The Honorable Judge Aileen Cannon presiding. The room fell silent as Judge Cannon nodded. "Be seated. This court is now in session." She glanced at the still empty defense table. "Mr. Bailiff, please escort Ms. Leavitt and her counsel into the courtroom." The side door opened, and Karoline Leavitt entered, followed by her attorney, Marcus Reynolds. A high-profile defender known for representing political figures, Leavitt wore a fitted navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Her expression was composed, almost serene, as she took her seat. Reynolds, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard, leaned over to whisper something in her ear. She nodded slightly but kept her eyes forward, meeting Judge Cannon's gaze with a confidence that bordered on defiance. "Good morning," Judge Cannon began, her voice neutral. "We're here to address statements made by Ms. Leavitt to the press regarding ongoing proceedings in this courtroom. Before we begin, I want to clarify that this is not a formal hearing on the underlying case, but rather a proceeding to address potential contempt of court." She turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Harrington, as an officer of this court, you have brought these statements to my attention. Please summarize your concerns." Harrington stood, buttoning his suit jacket. At 52, he had the gravitas of a seasoned federal prosecutor. "Your Honor, on April 28th, Ms. Leavitt appeared on the program American Morning and made statements that not only mischaracterized sealed judicial proceedings, but actively sought to undermine this court's authority and independence." He lifted a transcript. "With the court's permission, I would like to read the most pertinent sections." Judge Cannon nodded. "Proceed." Harrington cleared his throat. "Judge Cannon is deliberately ignoring key evidence," Ms. Leavitt stated. "She's keeping information from the American people because it doesn't fit the narrative she's trying to create. This isn't justice. It's a cover-up." He placed the transcript down. Ms. Leavitt then proceeded to discuss details of sealed motions that had not been made public, creating a false impression of the court's rulings and deliberative process. Judge Cannon turned to Reynolds. "Counsel, does your client dispute making these statements?" Reynolds rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that Ms. Leavitt made statements to the press. However, we contend that these statements fall well within her First Amendment rights to comment on matters of public concern. The First Amendment, Mr. Reynolds, does not protect statements that pose a clear and present danger to the administration of justice," Judge Cannon replied. "Nor does it protect deliberate mischaracterizations of sealed court proceedings." She turned her attention directly to Leavitt. Ms. Leavitt, you are not a party to the underlying case, nor are you counsel of record, yet you have repeatedly inserted yourself into these proceedings through public statements that go beyond commentary and venture into territory that threatens the integrity of this court. This is not the first time your public statements have prompted concern. Leavitt's expression remained unchanged, but a slight flush crept up her neck. Your Honor, Reynolds interjected. Ms. Leavitt's role as a political commentator gives her the right indeed, the responsibility to speak on matters that concern the public. Mr. Reynolds. Judge Cannon's voice hardened slightly. There is a vast difference between political commentary and what Ms. Leavitt has engaged in. She has characterized sealed proceedings, impugned this court's integrity, and attempted to influence potential jurors with information that is both privileged and, in many cases, inaccurate. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. In the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks or typed on silent keyboards. Judge Cannon's gaze returned to Leavitt. Ms. Leavitt, this court previously warned all parties and interested persons about making prejudicial statements to the media. That warning was explicit and on the record. Were you aware of this warning for the first time? Leavitt spoke directly. Yes, Your Honor. I was aware of it. And did you understand that your statements might constitute contempt of court? Leavitt's blue eyes held steady. I understood that the court had issued a warning, Your Honor. I did not believe my statements crossed that line. Judge Cannon let the silence hang for a moment. Ms. Leavitt, you attended Georgetown Law School. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you passed the bar in Virginia, though you currently do not practice law. That is correct. So you are familiar with the concept of contempt of court and the limitations on speech. When it comes to ongoing judicial proceedings, a flicker of unease finally crossed Leavitt's face. In theory, yes, Your Honor. Judge Cannon nodded slowly. Theory and practice, Ms. Leavitt, the foundation of our legal system. She turned to a document before her. I have reviewed the full transcript of your appearance, as well as your subsequent social media posts elaborating on your statements. I have also considered similar cases where individuals not directly involved in litigation have been found in contempt for statements that threaten the administration of justice. The courtroom was utterly silent now. Even the habitual coughers and fidgeters seemed frozen in anticipation. Ms. Leavitt, Judge Cannon began, her voice cutting through the hushed courtroom. This court has reviewed the statements you made to the press on April 28th. Regarding ongoing proceedings in this courtroom, Leavitt met the judge's gaze unflinchingly. Those statements not only mischaracterized judicial proceedings but actively undermined the court's authority and the jury's independence. Judge Cannon continued. This court previously warned all parties about making prejudicial statements to the media. Leavitt's attorney started to rise, but she placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Your Honor. With all due respect, Leavitt began. I have not finished. Ms. Leavitt, Judge Cannon interrupted, her typically measured tone hardening. This is not a political rally. This is a federal court. The gallery tensed. Judge Cannon, a Trump appointee herself, had surprisingly emerged as a stickler for procedure in recent months, defying expectations from both sides of the political spectrum. The judicial system functions on respect for process, Ms. Leavitt. Judge Cannon continued. When individuals with public platforms attempt to undermine the process through mischaracterization and inflammatory rhetoric, they threaten not just a single case but the foundation of our legal system. She lifted a sheet of paper. You claimed on national television that this court was deliberately suppressing evidence. You stated that I, as the presiding judge, was participating in a cover-up. You referenced sealed documents to which you should not have had access, and you mischaracterized their contents. Leavitt remained still, but her posture had stiffened slightly. These are not matters of opinion or political discourse, Judge Cannon said. These are false statements about judicial proceedings that were clearly intended to influence public perception of this court and, potentially, the jury pool. Reynolds rose again. Your Honor, If I may. You may not, Mr. Reynolds, Judge Cannon said firmly. I am addressing your client directly at this moment. She leaned forward slightly. Ms. Leavitt, as someone trained in the law, you understand the distinction between criticizing a judicial decision, which is protected speech, and attempting to interfere with judicial proceedings through false statements. Your actions fall squarely into the latter category. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual creaks of the old building seemed muted, as if the courthouse itself was holding its breath. This court cannot and will not allow such behavior to continue unchecked, Judge Cannon declared. The integrity of our judicial system depends on maintaining clear boundaries between political discourse and attempts to influence ongoing proceedings through misrepresentation. She straightened a stack of papers before her. I have considered various responses to your conduct, Ms. Leavitt. I have weighed the severity of your actions against the potential chilling effect of the harsh sanction on legitimate speech. Leavitt's fingers twitched slightly on the table before her, the only visible sign of tension. However, given your legal training, your deliberate mischaracterization of seal proceedings, and your clear intent to influence public perception of this court, a significant response is warranted. Judge Cannon's gaze swept the courtroom briefly. Before returning to Leavitt, this court finds you in contempt, Judge Cannon declared. You are hereby fined $30,000 to be paid within 30 days. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The amount was unexpectedly severe. The prosecutor, Harrington, nodded slightly, his expression neutral but satisfied. In the gallery, several reporters slipped out, presumably to file the breaking news. Reynolds was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, we object to this ruling and request an immediate stay pending appeal. This fine is disproportionate and constitutes an undue burden on Ms. Leavitt's exercise of free speech. Your objection is noted, Mr. Reynolds, Judge Cannon replied calmly. However, the fine stands. Ms. Leavitt knowingly violated a clear court order and interfered with the administration of justice. $30,000 reflects the severity of that interference and Ms. Leavitt's full awareness of the potential consequences. The judge turned back to Leavitt. Do you understand this ruling, Ms. Leavitt? All eyes turned to the young woman at the defense table. Leavitt's face had flushed crimson, her hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, it seemed she might erupt in the kind of passionate retort that had made her famous in political circles. The tension in the courtroom was electric, with many seemingly bracing for an outburst that would only compound her legal troubles. But then something unexpected happened. She smiled. It wasn't the defiant smirk that had become her trademark on television, nor was it the forced smile of someone concealing rage. It was a small, almost thoughtful smile that reached her eyes, the kind of smile that suggested not defeat, but a sudden change in strategy. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I accept your ruling. The words hung in the air, unexpected and disarming. Reynolds turned to his client in poorly concealed surprise. However, Leavitt continued, reaching into her briefcase and producing a manila folder. I'd like to submit this into evidence. Her attorney looked alarmed, clearly caught off guard by this unplanned move. Judge Cannon's brow furrowed. This is not an evidentiary hearing, Ms. Leavitt. What are you attempting to submit? Leavitt stood, folder in hand. Documentation of 17 similar statements made by counsel for the opposition, Your Honor. Statements that received no sanctions or warnings from this court. The courtroom, which had been silent, now filled with murmurs. Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ms. Leavitt, that's not relevant to the finding of contempt, Judge Cannon began. But Leavitt pressed on. With all due respect, Your Honor, it is entirely relevant, she said, her voice remaining respectful but carrying an undercurrent of steel. I merely wish to understand the standard being applied so I can comply appropriately. She opened the folder and continued, on March 14th. Prosecutor Harrington stated on Capitol Review that conservative donors are using this case to hide illegal activities On April 2nd, his deputy, Ms. Garcia, told the Washington Post that the defense team is deliberately misleading the court. With false evidence, Leavitt looked up from the folder. Neither was sanctioned. Neither was warned. I have 15 more examples, all documented, all verified, Judge. Cannon's expression darkened. She had not anticipated this counter move. Approached the bench. She commanded the two attorneys and Leavitt moved forward. Reynolds leaned close to his client, whispering urgently, but she gave a small shake of her head. Ms. Leavitt, Judge Cannon said in a low voice once they were before her. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. Leavitt replied, her voice equally quiet but unwavering. I'm simply presenting documented facts. If contempt is the appropriate response to public statements that mischaracterize court proceedings, then I accept that ruling completely. I'm merely seeking to understand why the standard appears to apply selectively. Harrington's face had darkened. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to deflect from Ms. Leavitt's own misconduct. The prosecution's statements have all been within the bounds of appropriate commentary. That's a matter of opinion, Mr. Harrington, Leavitt said, still addressing the judge, just as the appropriateness of my comments appears to be a matter of opinion. The difference is that I have documented both sets of statements for comparison. Judge Cannon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was trapped, and she knew it. To dismiss Leavitt's evidence without review would create exactly the appearance of bias that Leavitt had alleged. To accept it meant potentially having to acknowledge an inconsistency in the court's application of its own standards. Your Honor, Reynolds interjected, having recovered his composure. We request time to present this documentation formally, with the opportunity for both sides to address the comparative analysis. Judge Cannon weighed her options, aware that every eye in the courtroom was fixed on this whispered conference, straining to hear what was being said. The political implications were unavoidable. Whatever she decided would be interpreted through partisan lenses, dissected on cable news, and used as ammunition in the ongoing culture wars that had engulfed the judiciary. But beneath these considerations lay a more fundamental question. Was Leavitt right? Had the court been inconsistent in its application of standards regarding public commentary? If so, correcting that inconsistency was more important than avoiding the appearance of retreat. Return to your seats, she finally said. As Leavitt and both attorneys returned to their places, the whispers in the gallery grew. No one could hear the intense exchange, but the rigid set of the judge's shoulders and the determined tilt of Leavitt's chin told a story of its own. Judge Cannon sat in silence for a long moment, considering. The courtroom waited, the tension building with each passing second. Finally, she looked up. This court takes very seriously any allegation of inconsistent application of standards, she said. Her voice measured. Justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. The perception of fairness is as crucial as fairness itself. She turned to Leavitt. Ms. Leavitt, you've raised a serious concern. While it does not negate your own conduct, it merits review. Harrington started to object, but Judge Cannon raised a hand, silencing him. The court will recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to review these materials. Ms. Leavitt's fine is suspended pending review. Both parties will submit formal briefs by 5 p.m. today addressing the comparative analysis Ms. Leavitt has presented. She lifted her gavel, then paused. Let me be clear. This court is committed to the equal application of standards to all parties. If there has been inconsistency, it will be addressed. If there is not, the original contempt finding will stand. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, not the dramatic splintering of our opening scene, but decisive nonetheless. As people began to rise, Judge Cannon added, and all parties are reminded once again that prejudicial statements to the media regarding these proceedings will not be tolerated. That includes statements about today's hearing. The unexpected shift in dynamics set shockwaves through the courtroom. Reporters who had been ready to file stories about Leavitt's comeuppance now faced a more complex narrative. legal observers exchanged glances, recognizing the skilled maneuver Leavitt had executed. As the courtroom emptied, Leavitt gathered her papers with composed efficiency. Reynolds leaned close, speaking in low, urgent tones, but she merely nodded occasionally, her attention seemingly elsewhere. Across the aisle, Harrington and his team huddled in intense conversation, glancing occasionally at Leavitt with newfound wariness. In the back of the courtroom, two senior political operatives watched the proceedings with calculating eyes. One leaned to the other and whispered, "She just changed the game." Indeed, what had appeared to be a straightforward contempt ruling had suddenly become much more complicated, a microcosm of the larger political and cultural battles being waged across America's institutions. In that moment, Karoline Leavitt had transformed from defendant to challenger, from subject to agent. Outside the courthouse, a media frenzy awaited. Camera lights blazed in the mid-morning sun as reporters shouted questions. Harrington pushed through with a terse no comment, his expression stone-like. When Leavitt emerged, flanked by Reynolds and two assistants, the clamor intensified. Microphones thrust toward her face, questions overlapping into unintelligible noise. She raised a hand, and somehow, the crowd quieted. "I respect the court and its processes," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "That's why I provided documentation to ensure that all parties are held to the same standard. I have nothing further to say until Judge Cannon reviews the evidence." With that, she moved through the crowd, ignoring the follow-up questions that erupted in her wake. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, a sleek black SUV waited, its engine running. Before she reached it, a reporter from a major network stepped directly into her path. "Ms. Leavitt, critics are saying this is just another attempt to undermine the judicial system. How do you respond?" For a moment, it seemed Leavitt might ignore the question, but then she stopped, turning to face the camera with perfect media instinct. "The judicial system is undermined when standards aren't applied equally," she said, looking directly into the lens. "I believe in our courts. I believe in equal justice under law. That's what today was about." With that, she stepped into the waiting vehicle, which pulled away from the curb with professional smoothness. In the back seat, away from the cameras and microphones, Leavitt finally allowed herself a deep breath. Her hands, steady throughout the morning's proceedings, now trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. Reynolds, seated beside her, shook his head with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "We need to talk about your courtroom strategy, Karoline. Specifically, the part where you consult with your attorney before making dramatic moves." She offered a tired smile. "There wasn't time, Mark. I saw the opening and took it. It was risky," he said. "If Cannon had dismissed your evidence outright." "But she didn't," Leavitt interrupted, "because she couldn't, not without confirming exactly what I claimed about bias." The SUV turned onto the highway, accelerating away from the courthouse. Leavitt looked out the window at the Florida landscape rushing by. "Do you think we have them?" Reynolds asked after a moment. Leavitt's reflection in the glass showed the return of that small, thoughtful smile. "We have something better than a win, Mark. We have doubt. Doubt about the neutrality of the process. Doubt about the equal application of standards." She turned from the window. In the court of public opinion, doubt is often more powerful than victory. Reynolds studied his client with new appreciation. At 28, Karoline Leavitt had already established herself as one of the most effective communicators in American politics. But today had revealed something more, a strategic mind that could turn apparent defeat into potential advantage, a willingness to take calculated risks, and an instinctive understanding of how to shift narratives. "What's your next move?" he asked. Leavitt reached for her phone. "Now we wait. We let the story develop. We let people see that I didn't fight the fine or claim persecution. I simply asked for equal treatment." Her phone was already filling with notifications, messages from allies, interview requests from media outlets, updates from her staff tracking the public response. The narrative was already forming, shaped by those crucial moments in the courtroom and her brief statement outside. And tomorrow? Reynolds pressed. Leavitt's eyes met his, the fire that had been carefully banked in the courtroom now visible. Tomorrow depends on Judge Cannon. But whatever she decides, we'll be ready. As the SUV continued toward Miami, news alerts were already pinging on phones across America. The headlines varied by outlet, but all captured the unexpected turn. Leavitt challenges judge's contempt ruling with evidence of double standard. Political commentator turns tables in federal court. Judge Cannon's $30,000 fine suspended after bias allegations. In the courthouse she had left behind, Judge Aileen Cannon sat alone in her chambers, the manila folder Leavitt had provided opened before her. As she read through the documented statements, comparing them to her own rulings on similar matters, her expression grew increasingly troubled. The judge reached for her phone, dialing a number from memory. "James," she said when her call was answered. "It's Aileen. I need your perspective on something, and I need absolute honesty." In Washington, a senior White House advisor was being briefed on the morning's events. So Leavitt turned it around. He asked his aide. "Not yet," the young woman replied. "But she's created an opening. If Judge Cannon acknowledges any inconsistency in how she's handled similar statements, it validates Leavitt's larger narrative about institutional bias." The advisor nodded slowly. "And if Cannon doubles down, then Leavitt becomes a martyr for speaking truth to power." She positioned herself to win either way. "Clever girl," the advisor murmured. "Make sure we're prepared for either outcome." Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Brooklyn, a young law student watched the news coverage of the morning's events with rapt attention. Like many in her generation, she had grown disillusioned with the increasingly partisan nature of American institutions, including the judiciary. But today is confrontation not between left and right, but between power and accountability stirred something in her. She opened her laptop and began to write a blog post that would, by evening, be shared thousands of times. When Karoline Leavitt stood in that courtroom today, she wasn't just defending herself. She was asking a question all Americans should be asking. Are our standards applied equally? Or do they bend with political winds? As the day progressed, the story continued to evolve. Legal experts debated the merits of Leavitt's challenge on television panels. Political operatives calculated the implications for their respective sides. Ordinary citizens discussed it over dinner tables and in online forums, their perspectives shaped by their own experiences with systems that sometimes seemed to apply different standards to different people. But through it all, Karoline Leavitt remained silent, refusing all interview requests, letting the moment speak for itself. In the courthouse corridor after the recess was called, she had refused to comment to the press, but the slight upward curve of her lips had spoken volumes. She had not backed down, she had simply changed the battlefield. And as the sun set on that consequential day, both Judge Cannon and Karoline Leavitt prepared for a tomorrow that would resolve their immediate confrontation, but feed into the larger conflicts defining American public life. Whatever the outcome, something fundamental had shifted. A fine had been imposed, a challenge had been issued, and a young woman had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful response to authority is not defiance, but a simple question. Does this standard apply to everyone? Dawn broke over Fort Pierce with a breathtaking display of amber and rose that seemed incongruous with the tension simmering beneath the city's surface. By 6 a.m., the courthouse plaza had already begun to fill. News crews had staked out prime positions overnight, their satellite trucks forming a perimeter around the building like modern-day siege engines. Protesters from both sides of the political divide arrived with signs and chants, separated by barricades and watchful police officers. Inside her hotel suite 15 miles from the courthouse, Karoline Leavitt stood at the window, watching the ocean. She had slept little, her mind replaying the previous day's confrontation, analyzing each moment, each reaction. The stakes had risen exponentially overnight. What had begun as a personal battle her against Judge Cannon had transformed into something much larger, a symbol of the perceived unequal application of standards that many Americans felt characterized their institutions. Her phone had not stopped buzzing since she'd left the courthouse. Allies offering support, media requesting interviews, strategists proposing narratives. She had responded to none of them, preferring the solitude of her thoughts. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Reynolds entered, carrying coffee and a tablet loaded with the morning's news coverage. "You've created quite the storm," he said. Handing her a cup, Leavitt accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Have you reviewed the briefs from both sides?" "Yes." Harrington's team worked through the night. Their brief claims that the prosecution's statements were substantively different, from yours more measured, less inflammatory, more closely tied to public records. And our brief, compelling. We've laid out the parallels clearly, with timestamps, audience reach metrics, and potential jury impact assessments. If Cannon is honest, she'll see the double standard. Leavitt sipped her coffee, her gaze returning to the ocean. And if she's not, Reynolds hesitated, then we've still won in the court of public opinion. The narrative has already shifted from Leavitt crossed a line to does the system apply standards fairly? Either way, you emerge as someone willing to stand up to perceived injustice, even at personal cost. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. This was never about winning a news cycle, Mark. Then what was it about for a moment? It seemed she might not answer. Then she set down her coffee cup and straightened her shoulders. "Accountability," she said simply, "not just for Judge Cannon, but for all of us who claim to serve the public interest. If we demand integrity from our opponents, we must demand it from ourselves as well." Reynolds studied her with new interest. In Washington's cynical ecosystem, such earnestness was rare, particularly from someone who had navigated its treacherous waters as successfully as Leavitt had. "You continue to surprise me," he admitted. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good. Predictability is death in our line of work." She glanced at her watch. "We should prepare. Court reconvenes in 3 hours." In her chambers at the courthouse, Judge Aileen Cannon had also passed a restless night. The documents Leavitt had provided were spread across her desk, annotated, and cross-referenced with her own rulings. Coffee cups accumulated as the hours passed. Physical evidence of her struggle with the questions Leavitt had raised. Her clerk, Sophia, entered with another stack of papers, the final briefs. "Judge." Both were submitted just before the deadline. Cannon nodded, reaching for them. "What's the scene outside?" "Crowded. Security has expanded the perimeter. They're expecting larger numbers than yesterday." And the media coverage, Sophia hesitated, divided along predictable lines. Liberal outlets are characterizing Ms. Leavitt's move as a cynical attempt to avoid consequences. Conservative media is portraying it as exposing judicial bias, and the legal blogs, the academic commentary, more nuanced. Several respected legal scholars have noted that the question of equal application of contempt standards is legitimate, regardless of the political dimensions. Judge Cannon removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. "This was never supposed to be political, Sophia. With respect, Judge, everything is political now." The young clerk's voice was gentle but firm. "That doesn't mean we surrender to it." Cannon replaced her glasses and reached for the briefs. "I need an hour of uninterrupted time with these. Then we'll proceed." As Sophia left, Cannon turned to the window. The rising sun illuminated the courthouse's neoclassical facade, casting long shadows across the plaza below. The building had stood for decades, weathering storms both meteorological and political. It would weather this one too. But would she? The question lingered as she turned back to the documents before her. The evidence Leavitt had presented was troubling not because it exonerated Leavitt, but because it suggested a pattern that Cannon had not recognized in herself. A subtly different standard applied to different voices. It was not deliberate bias, of that she was certain. but intention and impact were different matters. If she had inadvertently created an appearance of unequal treatment, the damage to judicial credibility was real regardless of her intent. The phone on her desk rang, her direct line, rarely used. She answered with caution. "Aileen, it's James." The chief judge of the Southern District, James Morrison, a man who had mentored her since her appointment. "James, I'm assuming this isn't a social call." "No." His voice was grave. "The administrative office is concerned about today's hearing. There's a sense that this could escalate beyond a routine contempt matter." "It already has," she said dryly. "You know what I mean, Aileen. This has the potential to become another flashpoint in the larger cultural conflict." The Chief Justice has been briefed. Cannon straightened. "The Supreme Court is monitoring a contempt hearing in my courtroom. Not officially. But yes, there's awareness at the highest levels. Your handling of this will be watched closely." The pressure of those words settled on her shoulders like a physical weight. "I appreciate the warning, James, but it changes nothing. I'll rule based on the evidence before me, not on political considerations. I would expect nothing less." He replied, "But be prepared for the aftermath, whatever you decide. This won't end in your courtroom today." After the call ended, Cannon sat motionless, absorbing the implications. What had begun as a routine exercise of the court's contempt powers had evolved into something that had captured the attention of the highest levels of the judiciary. Her ruling would be dissected not just by the media and the public, but by her peers and superiors. She turned back to the briefs with renewed determination. If her decision would be scrutinized, then it would withstand that scrutiny. She would follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the political consequences. By 8:30 a.m., the courtroom was filled to capacity. Additional seating had been arranged, and still, there was a line stretching down the corridor. Security had been enhanced, with additional marshals positioned throughout the room. In the gallery, the usual assortment of journalists and legal observers had been joined by political figures from both parties, each sensing the potential significance of the day's proceedings. A congressional delegation sat in a reserved section, their presence underscoring the political dimensions of what should have been a straightforward legal matter. At 8:45, Leavitt entered with Reynolds, both impeccably dressed and composed. She nodded to several allies in the gallery but maintained a serious demeanor, appropriate to the setting. Harrington and his team arrived minutes later, huddling at the prosecution table, an intense conversation. As the clock ticked toward 9 a.m., a hush fell over the room. The bailiff entered, followed by Judge Cannon. "All rise. The United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida is now in session." The Honorable Judge Aileen Cannon presiding. Judge Cannon took her seat, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Be seated. This court is now in session." She adjusted her microphone slightly. "Yesterday, this court issued a contempt ruling against Ms. Karoline Leavitt and imposed a fine of $30,000 for statements made to the press that mischaracterized judicial proceedings and potentially undermined the integrity of this court. Following that ruling, Ms. Leavitt presented documentation alleging similar statements by the prosecution that received no sanctions. The judge paused, looking directly at Leavitt. "The court has reviewed the materials submitted by Ms. Leavitt, as well as the briefs presented by both sides regarding the comparison of statements and their treatment by this court." The silence in the courtroom was absolute, every person present aware that they were witnessing a moment that would likely be cited in legal textbooks for years to come. After careful consideration, I find merit in the concern about consistency in this court's application of standards regarding public statements. Murmurs rippled through the gallery before being silenced by a sharp look from the bench. Specifically, Judge Cannon continued, "This court acknowledges that certain statements by the prosecution, while perhaps less inflammatory in tone, contain similarly problematic characterizations of sealed proceedings. These statements did not receive the same level of scrutiny or sanction as Ms. Leavitt's comments. Harrington shifted in his seat, his expression darkening. At the defense table, Reynolds placed a cautioning hand on Leavitt's arm, though her face remained impassive. However, Judge Cannon's voice hardened slightly. This does not excuse Ms. Leavitt's conduct. Two wrongs do not make a right, particularly in matters of judicial respect. The judge closed the folder before her. The court therefore modifies its ruling. Ms. Leavitt's fine is reduced to $5,000. She paused, letting this sink in before continuing. Additionally, counsel for both sides are ordered to submit all public statements for review by this court before release, effective immediately. Any violation will result in contempt charges. Is that understood? Both legal teams nodded, but it was what happened next that stunned the courtroom. Your Honor, Leavitt stood, asking permission to speak. After a moment's hesitation, Judge Cannon nodded. I want to apologize to the court, Leavitt said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. While I believe in robust public discourse, I recognize that the judicial process requires special protections. The gallery exchanged glances. This was unexpected from a woman known for her combative style. I will pay the $5,000 fine today, she continued, and I would like to donate an additional $25,000 to the federal court's civic education initiative to help educate young Americans about the importance of an independent judiciary. Judge Cannon's composure slipped for a moment, genuine surprise crossing her features before she regained control. The court acknowledges your gesture, Ms. Leavitt. Leavitt remained standing. If I may add one thing, Your Honor, despite our differences, I have always respected your commitment to principle. Our system depends on judges who apply the law as they see it, regardless of political pressure. She sat down, leaving a courtroom in shock. Harrington stared at her with undisguised suspicion. Several journalists slipped out, rushing to file updates on this unexpected development. Judge Cannon cleared her throat. In light of Ms. Leavitt's statement, the court would like to add that it regrets any inconsistency in the application of standards regarding public commentary. This court is committed to equal treatment of all parties, regardless of their political affiliations or viewpoints. She looked over the courtroom. The integrity of our judicial system depends on not just the reality, but the perception of fairness. When that perception is compromised, we all lose. Regardless of which side appears to benefit in the moment, the judge closed her folder. The contempt matter is resolved. Ms. Leavitt will pay the modified fine as indicated. All parties will comply with the new requirements regarding public statements. This session is adjourned. The gavel fell, and the room erupted in conversation. As security began to usher people out, the dynamics in the courtroom had shifted fundamentally. What had begun as a punitive measure against Leavitt had transformed into a moment that humanized both women. Judge Cannon, initially seen as delivering a political rebuke, now appeared as a jurist committed to even-handed justice. Leavitt, rather than playing the victim, had elevated herself by acknowledging the court's vital role while still standing her ground. As Judge Cannon left the bench, her clerk leaned close. That was unexpected, Sophia murmured. Which part? Cannon asked dryly. All of it, but especially Ms. Leavitt's response. Do you think it was sincere? The judge considered this as they walked toward her chambers. Does it matter? The effect is the same either way. You don't think this was calculated? Of course it was calculated, Cannon replied. Everything in that courtroom is calculated, including my rulings. The question isn't whether it was strategic, but whether the strategy aligned with something genuine. They reached her chambers, and Cannon paused at the door. I think Ms. Leavitt is as complicated as the rest of us, Sophia, capable of both political calculation and sincere principle. Sometimes in the same moment, outside on the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed around both legal teams. As they emerged, Harrington pushed through with terse answers, clearly dissatisfied with the outcome. When asked if the prosecution would appeal the modified ruling, He replied only, "We're considering all options." When Leavitt appeared, the media frenzy intensified. Cameras pressed close, questions shouted from all directions. Rather than retreating to her vehicle as she had the previous day, she approached the microphone stand that had been set up. "I respect Judge Cannon and this court," she said, the cameras capturing her every word. "We can disagree about politics, while agreeing on the fundamental importance of our institutions. That's what makes America work." A reporter shouted, "Was your donation politically motivated?" Leavitt's expression remained serious. "Our courts aren't political footballs. They're the foundation of our democracy. If we want to criticize judicial decisions, which is our right, we should first understand how courts function and why judicial independence matters. Do you regret your original comments?" Another called out, "I regret that they were perceived as an attack on the court itself rather than a critique of specific decisions." She replied carefully, "There's an important distinction there that I failed to make clear." With that, she stepped away from the microphones, declining further questions. As she walked toward her waiting vehicle, phones throughout the crowd lit up with notifications. The story was breaking across all platforms, with headlines ranging from Leavitt's stunning courtroom apology to Judge Cannon acknowledges double standard in contempt ruling. In her SUV, Reynolds looked at Leavitt with newfound respect. "That was masterful," he said as they pulled away. "You've completely reframed the narrative." Leavitt leaned back against the leather seat, the tension of the past 24 hours finally showing in the slight slump of her shoulders. "It wasn't just strategy, Mark. No. She gazed out the window at the city passing by. "We've become so tribal that we can't even agree on basic facts anymore, let alone principles. Someone has to start building bridges instead of burning them." Reynolds studied her. "Is that what you were doing, building bridges?" A slight smile curved her lips. Among other things, as the vehicle merged onto the highway, Leavitt's phone buzzed with a message from her chief of staff, every major network requesting interviews. "How do you want to proceed?" She typed a quick response. "One interview only. National, not cable. Focus on judicial independence, not partisan angles." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Turning down cable news? That's a first. Cable thrives on conflict." Leavitt replied, "For this to work, we need to reach beyond the base, beyond the already convinced." "For what to work, exactly?" She hesitated, then turned to face him fully. "A recalibration. Politics has become total war, with no rules, no boundaries. It's consuming our institutions from within. And you want to change that." Reynolds couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "You, who's been on the front lines of some of the most aggressive political messaging of the past decade. People can evolve, Mark, even political operatives." Her tone was light, but her eyes were serious. "Besides, it's not just idealism, it's pragmatism. The current trajectory isn't sustainable. Someone has to start steering us back toward a functional system, or there won't be a system left to fight over." The SUV continued south toward Miami as news of the morning's events spread across the country. Political analysts were already declaring it a masterclass in crisis management, with commentators from both sides finding elements to praise. Legal scholars noted the significance of a federal judge acknowledging inconsistency in her own application of standards, a rare moment of institutional self-correction. Back at the courthouse, Judge Cannon watched Leavitt's brief press statement. On a muted television in her chambers, she switched it off and turned to the window, gazing out at the Florida sunshine that bathed the city in golden light. As she reached for her water glass, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced down at the screen and froze. The text was from an unknown number. "Excellent performance today. The recording is safe. Payment is agreed." Attached was a photo Judge Cannon and Leavitt in what appeared to be a hotel bar. Heads bent close in conversation, dated just 2 days earlier. Cannon's hand trembled as she deleted the message. Outside her window, camera flashes continued to capture Leavitt's triumphant departure. The young woman's brilliant strategy hadn't been improvised at all. It had been choreographed from the beginning. The judge opened her desk drawer and removed an envelope containing $15,000 in cash. The other half would come later. She had crossed a line she never thought she would cross, all because of one moment of weakness. One indiscreet conversation, one mistake that Leavitt's people had captured. The fine had been paid publicly, but privately, a different price altogether, had just come due. And in Washington, where everyone had secrets, Judge Aileen Cannon had just acquired one that could end everything she had worked for. She picked up her phone again and typed a single word in response: understood.